Information Center Livable Communities webinar. Today's webinar is titled Creating Great Communities Through Public Involvement, Organizational Models for Public Involvement, and we will be speaking with Peter Lagerwey, Seattle Regional Office Director for Tool Design Group. This is the first of two webinars exploring how to leverage community support to build more livable communities. The second webinar will be held July 17th. My name is James Gallagher, and I am the PBIC's Communication Manager. I will be facilitating today's webinar. This webinar has been submitted to AICP and may be approved for 1.5 CM credits. The Road Safety Academy, which is the training and education arm of the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, is a registered provider of CM credits. For more information on the Road Safety Academy, please visit rsa.unc.edu. For more information on future webinars or to view the archives from this webinar series and others, please visit pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. You can also stay abreast of PBIC webinars by following us on Facebook at facebook.com/pedbike. In addition to these webinars, PBIC offers 4 different in-person training courses to provide technical assistance to professionals and community members in developing pedestrian safety action plans and in improving conditions for walking. These courses can be found at pedbikeinfo.org/gettraining. This webinar in particular was derived from one of those courses on creating livable communities. If you'd like to know more about the Creating Livable Communities in-person seminar, please go to pedbikeinfo.org/gettraining. Before I pass the screen over to Peter, I want to let you know that Peter told me that he doesn't think this webinar will take the full hour and a half today, so we may finish a little early. Now I'd like to welcome and thank Peter for his presentation. Peter, I'm going to give you the screen.
Well, thank you, James. And as is suggested by the title, is that we're creating great communities through public involvement. I've worked in about 230 communities over the years, and one of the things I've noticed is that those communities that systematically and continually create great communities in terms of walking and bicycling are the ones that really understand and do the public involvement right. And a lot of communities may do bits and pieces, but not fundamentally change their entire communities. The ones that really are successful, almost all of them that at least I've worked with, really understand how to do public involvement in a comprehensive, institutionalized, ongoing kind of way. So that really generated my interest in this topic. I think all of us want to see good outcomes from our work. We want to see our work be fruitful, and one of the best ways that we can do this is really to understand and engage the public involvement. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of the institutional models for how to do public involvement. It isn't something that just happens accidentally, but you really need to be thorough and purposeful about it. So a few of the learning objectives today is I want to really go through in a little more detail why public involvement is necessary, and what is the added value, if you will, through public involvement. I want to talk about some of the institutional models for how to do public involvement. Also talk quite a bit about tone. This is really about building relationships, positive relationships between government agencies, transportation agencies, and the people who live in those communities, the people who pay those taxes that fund our transportation system. And then to understand some of the current structures and opportunities for public involvement. So I'm going to go through at a fairly high level some of the different models, and then the next webinar we will get into some more detail on some of these different models. So in addition to that, some of the topics I'll be covering is the magic of 25, sort of how to be ubiquitous in terms of public involvement. Really knowing what you want to achieve. One of the things that I've discovered working with both community groups, advocacy groups, and even governmental agencies is really a lack of focus on what you want to achieve. And if you don't have that focus, sort of anything goes. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Part of staying focused is to have an annual work plan and have do a report card every year really do performance measures, know where you're going. And again, these are just some of the background things that I'll talk about a little bit more as we move on. And then, as I mentioned already, the tone and approach, building relationships. When I talk about the gentle nudge and the big thanks, one of the things that I always, when I work with, say, advocacy groups of some sort, I always give them the 3-to-1 rule. You need to have 3 thank yous for every, you could have done better, maybe a little bit of a whine. So certainly there's a place for back and forth and saying you could do better, but there's also a huge place for working collaboratively and recognizing good work. So sometimes, quite often, when I work with an advocacy group and they're feeling like they're not getting anywhere, I ask them, well, when did you send the last thank you letter? And quite often they can't think of it. So that kind of relationship building and really working together, acknowledging good work is incredibly important. So getting back to the first question, why public involvement? One of the things that I've always discovered fairly early on is that quite often there can be a gap between what you think citizens want and what they actually want. And I'll tell a little story later on that in the situation that I was involved in. But here, just to make that point, is that one of the reasons to have public involvement is you really want to do a good job of listening so that you can really hear what people want. And when we guess, we quite often get it wrong. And so a lot of times, for example, there could be a big project, and it's a big, say, corridor project, and what the citizens really want there is to be able to get across the street at a particular corner to a school or a grocery store. If you don't do that listening, you don't know that, you may put your focus in terms of a safe crossing in the wrong place. So really that gap between, again, what you think they want and what citizens want, and really understanding that. The second point here, and this is one I always like to make, is the difference between problem identification and solutions. People in the community are very, very good at identifying a problem. They may or may not be really good at identifying a solution. And so one of the training things that I always do with people is to help them go behind a suggested solution and look at the problem. So it's not uncommon, for example, if you work for a transportation agency, you get a phone call and say, I want a stop sign, and to give you an intersection. And the stop sign may or may not be the right solution, but a little more conversation and a little more talking, you might find out that what the real problem is speeding on that street. Or maybe the real problem is it's a street you can't get across. And so, but more than likely, if you're getting a lot of calls about a location, there in fact is a problem there. It may or may not, the right solution may or may not have been identified. So I think one of the jobs on the listening side in terms of why public involvement is to really do a good job of listening to the community on problem identification. They're going to be good at that. Your job as a professional, if you work in transportation, is going to be to then come up with solutions that addresses that problem. I always put fundraising. You see fundraising here in terms of why have public involvement. The reason I put fundraising here is because ultimately the people who live in communities pay the taxes that fund transportation, and if people don't feel listened to, and if people don't feel like their government is delivering what their community needs, they're not going to be willing to support the taxes that it takes to create a transportation system. I think we all know that there's a funding crisis in transportation. I'm not going to get into that now, but at all different levels. And one of the ways to address that is to do a good job of listening at the local, regional, state level so that people feel that their priorities are being met in terms of what's being delivered. And this is going to become more and more important over the years. I've noticed a lot of communities are now coming up with creative ways of funding things in their community, done more at a local or regional level probably than in the past. And it's those communities where people feel listened to that they're willing to vote to tax themselves or willing to vote to have elected officials take advantage of local taxing options. But it really comes down again to why public involvement. It's directly related to fundraising. And then sustainability and momentum. One of the things that I've seen in a lot of communities is there'll be a couple good projects, or there might be a small area of a community where there's really some wonderful things happening, great community, getting back to that theme, but it may not be sustainable, may not have the momentum to occur over a number of years and really occur over an entire community. Creating a great place to live, you need a big vision, and part of that big vision is to have ongoing public involvement. And then finally, one here that I'm just going to add that I did put on this list is you really have to believe that public involvement will lead to a better product. If you don't believe that, that will come across in your public involvement, and the community will pick up on that right away, that possibly you're just going through the motions because you're supposed to. And public involvement, even though it can be a bit painful sometimes, and you can go down some side paths, if you will, from time to time, in the end, most of the time you're going to get a better product, especially if you do the public involvement correctly and you're really focusing on helping identify the problems that need to be solved. So I'm going to go through some of the organizational models for public involvement. And again, what I've discovered over the years is that those communities that really do public involvement well do a good job in all these different areas. So at one level, you have government-sponsored boards and commissions, and those are the ones usually created, say, by a resolution or an ordinance. I'll talk more about this in a second. But those are those official, like a bike advisory board or a pedestrian advisory board, and I'll go through some of the other kinds of boards and commissions. A typical community might have, a medium-sized town could have up to 50 boards and commissions in that particular town. Some places have a little less. I've seen a lot of places also have up to 100 or more. So it really, really something that can be very, very important. Just as a sidebar, one of the things that I've seen pedestrian and bike advocacy groups do is to make a list of all the boards and commissions in their community, identify which ones do things important related to creating a great community, especially in terms of bicycling and walking, and then try to get their members on each one of those boards and commissions. So there might be maybe a dozen in your community that you want to serve on that are important that way. So I also discovered that quite often there's vacancies on these boards and commissions. There can also be a lack of leadership. So if you've had trained volunteers and you really want to be part of these, there's really a lot of opportunities in this area. Advocacy groups, the second one. These are groups that are formed for a specific reason. So if you're interested in bicycling, you join the advocacy group. If you're interested in walking, you join the advocacy group. If you're interested in greenways, maybe you join that group. Or if you're interested in trails, maybe you have a trails group. Or you're interested in parks. But the idea is that it's interest-based and special interest, if you will, in the good sense of the word, the advocacy groups. And again, those communities that really do well over time really have well-established, sophisticated, good advocacy groups. And I'll talk more about that later. Then the third area is the area of neighborhood-based community organizations. So those are groups that if you're going to be a member, either you live in that community or maybe you have a business in that community, but it's geographically based, and a lot of communities have those as well. And having both the general everywhere advocacy groups and the neighborhood-based groups, both are equally important in terms of a comprehensive involvement. And then the last but not least are individuals, and I'll talk more about those in a minute, but individuals can play a really key role in terms of public involvement as well. So again, the point here is when you think of public involvement, don't just think one of these areas, think all of them, and how can we have a positive relationship with these different groups, how can they all be engaged, and how can they all be brought into the decision-making process. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the types of public involvement. I think you can, though I'll touch on these a little bit later, you can see the list there. The only thing I would mention, and I'll touch on some of these later, is that certainly the social media aspect of public involvement is becoming more and more important. More recently, when I've checked with people how they found out about an event or how they got involved in something, quite often it's through social media, and quite often I'm finding that, like working with resenders groups, things like that, that's a really good way to get the word out. The other thing I would just mention here is that you really want to be inclusive in terms of your strategies, and recognize that not everyone knows English. Recognize that people communicate in completely different ways. Some people are only going to do social media. Some people really just want to talk. Some people are more visual. Some people like to write. And I think some people go to meetings. Some people don't. And I think the messaging here is to really understand your community, and the public involvement needs to look like your community. And if there's gaps in that, then you really need to strategize about how do you bring people into the process without, for example, having to go to a meeting. And you can see the list there. And I'll touch on a few of these later, but I think the messaging here that I want to leave with is really create a comprehensive approach to public involvement strategies. The other is to be holistic. What you don't want to do is give away sort of the decision-making to only, say, for example, if you're putting in a trail, the adjacent property owners. They're a very important stakeholder group, but you also want to make it much broader and inclusive so that you really have a community discussion on issues, and not just leave it to a few people who may or may not be excited about what's happening. So I just want to go into a little bit more of detail on some of these different kinds of public involvement. The first one I'll talk a little bit about is, and again, these are the ones I covered a minute ago, is government-sponsored boards and commissions. And I already mentioned that it could be easily up to a dozen or more that if you're a bike or a pedestrian advocacy group, you want to become involved in. Some are made up completely of citizen groups, and other ones may have a mix of government representatives and citizens. The key is that you want to really understand of what kind of a group is it. Is it advisory, or does it have actual regulatory authority? Most government-sponsored boards and commissions are going to be advisory. Then the question comes up, of course, is if you're only advisory, how do you become effective? And I'll cover this in more detail in the subsequent webinar, but it's a couple of rules of thumb. Your advisory group, say a bicycle advisory board, needs to look like the community. And it needs to look like the community in terms of age, the types of cyclists, ethnicity. It really needs to represent the broad community. If it doesn't, then you have permission to ignore it because you're saying this only represents, say, 2 or 3% of the population. So that's really key. The other is that it's really important that the boards and commissions be established by like a resolution, and when people get on these boards and commissions, that they get recognized, say, in front of the city council or whatever governance you have, so that it becomes a very big deal and you elevate the advisory nature of it. You're really going to get the best outcomes. Advocacy groups, again, I mentioned this is special interest in the best sense of the word, And there's different kinds of groups. I mentioned pedestrian bicycle. You could have a complete streets advocacy group, historic preservation, business owners, safety committees. There's all different kinds of advocacy groups. And again, these groups really need to do a good job of both advocating for things, but also recognizing the good things that are done. And one of the number of times I work with advocacy groups, and again, they've not been saying thank you ever. And then I'm saying, well, why should anybody ever listen to you? Because you don't get a thank you at the end anyways. There's no upside to working with you guys. So it really needs to be built on developing good relationships and saying, showing appreciation for all the good things that are done, and but at the same time, really doing a good job of being thorough, educating your members. When I work with advocacy groups, they always say, well, what should we do? And I always tell them, take your 10 best advocates, send them to ProWalk, ProBike, send them to some training, and make sure that they really are informed advocates, know what they're doing, and really can focus on the right issues. It's very, very easy to have enthusiasm, but lack of knowledge, and maybe focus on the wrong issues. And to just give you an example, say you're a pedestrian advocate and your goal is to reduce crashes. We know that most pedestrians are hit crossing the street, not walking along the street. And yet I've seen advocacy groups only focus on sidewalks and forget about safe crossings, and then really don't get changed outcomes in terms of the number of crashes and injuries, fatalities in terms of in their neighborhood. So it's that kind of basic knowledge base of knowing what you need to do to accomplish your goals. Okay, again, just expanding on neighborhood-based community organizations. Like I said, they're geographically based. It can be a neighborhood association, chamber of commerce, neighborhood safety committee. The idea here, again, is that you need to be in that neighborhood to be part of that neighborhood association. Where the real synergy comes is when you have the neighborhood-based groups and the advocacy groups saying the same thing. And I'm going to tell you a little story about this in a minute in terms of how to work with a neighborhood-based advocacy group. But again, these are very, very important. They also need to be part of the public involvement process. And then individuals. And individuals can play a number of different roles. Sometimes they can be a spokesperson for a larger group, and that certainly can be a very good way of involving individuals. Depending on the community, you may have individual power brokers, to be a business person, something like that, who plays a particular role in a community. And then, of course, you get some lone rangers. And some lone rangers can be a challenge, but very often they also represent a certain sentiment and a certain segment of the community and need to be listened to. So I'm just going to go on to just a few of the more detailed ways of having public involvement. I mentioned before the importance of being comprehensive and giving people a variety of options. I've discovered over time there's a fair number of people who just don't go to big public meetings, but they're people that really need to be listened to, and a lot of people are more comfortable in a small group as opposed to a bigger venue. So some of the groups that I've had particular success working with are like senior citizens. There could be, say, a senior living center where people just don't leave that very quickly. And so having it right at the senior center, talking about some of the crossing issues, some of the challenges they face, can be very, very informative and really get a lot of good information in terms of identifying problems, say, with a particular intersection or crossing or something like that. Working with a local merchants group, chamber of commerce, very, very important. They're going to know the pickup and delivery. They're going to know the curbside management challenges. They're going to know any parking issues they have. They're going to know speeding issues. They're going to know issues about crossing the street. So again, be very, very valuable. Schools, I think we're all familiar with the Safe Routes to School movement. Doing focus groups around schools involving the principal, teachers, parents, kids at the school can be an extremely good way, again, to both identify problems and come up with strategies. First responders, I put enforcement here, but it really is broader than that, is bringing first responders together and really talking about some of the challenges and solutions, again, of things that you can do within transportation. And then finally, public health. And there'll be other ones. I'm just trying to give you some examples of how to do sort of think through this. Is public health is becoming more and more involved in transportation. And we're finding that we're learning a lot from public health. Just give you an example. The public health community does a very good job quite often of doing before and after studies, of looking at, we tried this, does it really work? And bringing some of that critical thinking to transportation, both planning but also implementation, has been very, very good. So anytime you do something related to transportation, we're seeing public health at the table. Should be a welcome guest, and they have a lot of skills and good things to bring to the conversation. I'm just throwing this one in because this is probably the least effective way to do public involvement. It's usually done as a requirement. You know, you have to have a public meeting. Usually there's a plan. People come and talk to it. Quite often people go away with a feeling like this doesn't work very well. They've already made all the decisions, and people may not even stay on topic when they're there. They'll talk about something completely irrelevant, and it's a we, them, how many people show up kind of situation. So there are times when you need to do sort of public hearings, but typically I think we're moving away from that kind of forum. Hasn't been found to be very collaborative and productive. I put this picture in here because most of the people there look like a little skeptical and gloomy, and that's usually you're getting talked to and then you talk back, and it's not really a productive dialogue. Other kinds of workshops and meetings I think are becoming more popular, and they really are more engaging and really opportunity to talk through different kinds of outcomes that can work very, very well. Some of the ones, and I'll just touch more on these in a minute, but certainly, you know, open houses. There can be a presentation within the open house. Other options include things like Charettes, web surveys, a lot of different ways, again, as I mentioned before, involving the public. It doesn't have to be, you know, a stand-up kind of public hearing kind of thing. One of the things you're seeing a lot more of is community workshops, and this is just an example of how you might do a typical agenda. One of the things that I always like to do is do an introductory exercise. I ask people why they're there and write it down and make sure that we address the issues that come up when people introduce themselves. There's some easy visioning exercises you can do. You're working with a community. I always start with identifying problems, like the concerns list, and then do a short presentation. And then so people have some guidelines to work with, and then doing some, might even include a little walkabout outside, and then coming back together and really doing some work sessions. And find that if people come up with their own solutions based on, you know, some guided information, they own it, they're going to support it, and you end up really with a we as opposed to a collective we versus an us-them situation. And so again, workshops can be a really wonderful way to do public involvement, especially at the neighborhood level where, say, you're doing a neighborhood plan or something like that. You see on the bottom the dots. It's just, you know, they come up with the different things in the workshop, and then you get to vote on them, and you really get a sense of where the community wants to go. Open houses certainly is another great way to involve people. Typically, you're going to have a lot of different stations, and each station will be a different way to involve the public. So in the picture here, you can see a map, and people are putting little stickers on it to identify a variety of things related to that particular project. But there'd be, on most open houses, you might have 5 or 6, 7 different stations. Each one has to provide different information and provide a different way to involve the public, and again, going to people's comfort level. So you want to make sure that people can just be involved by talking, or by writing, or by turning in a comment form, or going online and filling something out. But again, you really want to meet different needs, different people, and really have a diverse way of being involved. Just some other things that you can add to this, easy to do. You can see again on this map here using the stickies. On the upper image here, you can vote on things. It's a wonderful way. You can also do some simple surveys or whatever the case may be. But again, most people, for example, are comfortable using little stickies and buttons, and that's easy to do. You get a high rate of participation. So just a little bit about presentations. And I have the 2 words here, inform and educate. Within the context of doing public involvement, whether it be charrette, whether it be an open house, usually there should be a presentation part of it. And what you really want to do is give people good information so they can make good comments. And people aren't traffic engineers, they aren't city planners, but they do live in their community, and they do know, again, the problems in their community. So the whole point of a presentation is to help people articulate what the problems are, and then understand what kinds of countermeasure solutions might work to address those problems. One of the things that, again, that I always do is when doing a workshop or doing a charrette or an open house, is find out a way of having people who live in the community actually do some of the presentations, develop some of their own solutions, again, with a guided process. People take ownership of it. They're going to get more buy-in, and again, you get away from them, us, we, them kind of scenario. Just a couple things about charrettes. These are multi-day events. They can be somewhat expensive, but they really work well for corridor planning or for maybe a downtown area planning. And they really are a compilation of all the things that I've talked about. So over a period of days, you can do focus groups, you can do field tours, you do presentations, you do trainings, you do workshops. So it's just a way of taking all these activities, pulling them all into one, and then at the end of the process, really having, developing a consensus for how you move forward. A few of the things that you want to include in a charrette as well is when you start looking at solutions, is really writing out the pros and cons of potential solutions. I think it's really important to convey that most of the kinds of things you're going to do are fairly nuanced, and a lot of things have unintended consequences, and every countermeasure, every solution has a right place to do it and a wrong place. So the example I always like to give is you like stop sign, 4-way stops or stop signs. And of course the answer always is, it depends. There's a very appropriate place to put stop signs, and there's places that it's absolutely the wrong solution. So it's really to introduce to the public a lot of this too in terms of pros and cons. The fact that all of this is fairly nuanced, and at the end of the day, there certainly are guidelines and rules, but it also takes some good engineering judgment to make the right, the right calls. So, excuse me. This really is an opportunity to do some of that education. Again, on advocacy groups, I'm going to cover this more in the next webinar that we do, but I call it the magic of 25, and just to point out that to be an effective group, you don't need a lot of people. Having a lot of people is fantastic, but you don't necessarily need that many people. I've worked with groups of people. I always give the example of 25. simply because there's 52 weeks in a year, two weeks off for the holidays. So if you have 25 people, you have 50 weeks, and you just get everybody to commit to a little bit of social media, some emails, posting something on Facebook or whatever, a couple letters, a couple phone calls, a couple meetings, you're going to have people representing your group at every single major public event in your community. So I always go back to the notion that people's time is their most valuable resource, the most valuable gift that they can give their community, and if they're going to give that gift, then it has to be worthwhile. I also think it's important to kind of lower the involvement bar. It doesn't need to burn you out. It doesn't need to make your life miserable. You can have a fairly reasonable level of commitment and still get a lot done. A lot of times in communities I'll see there's just like 1, 2, 3, 4 leaders who burn themselves out and then wonder why they're not getting very good results. I think everyone on the public agency side is aware of activists. The same face shows up at every single meeting. You're going to know what that person, that he or she is going to say ahead of time, and so that person starts getting tuned out because they sound like a broken record. And you may come to the conclusion they don't represent very many people anyways. So the idea of 25 is to really make public involvement diverse, fun, healthy, effective, a lot of different faces, be ubiquitous, building relationships, but at the same time, it doesn't need to be an effort that's outside what's reasonable. Just a couple of case studies. This one was in Oakland, California. They were doing a pedestrian master planning process. And the reason I just mentioned this one here, because I hadn't mentioned it before, is that you can do project-based public involvement. And that's another one that can be very, very effective. And in this case, it was with a pedestrian master plan. But there's nothing wrong with forming advisory groups that form for the length of a particular plan without necessarily being there forever. So there's a beginning, there's an end, and again, same principles apply. When you do a project-based advisory group, it needs to look like the community, and secondly, it needs to have broad representation, both from people in the exact area where the project is, but it also needs to have some broader representation so that you really get that mix of the whole community and doing what's best for everyone. I'm just going to tell you a little story of something that happened in Seattle, because I happened to be here when this was going on. A number of years ago, they did 38 neighborhood plans, and 36 of the 38 plans mentioned walking considerations in terms of things that they wanted in their community. And what was interesting about this, and this gets back to the first point that I made, is that we have to do a good job of listening so that what transportation agencies think the community wants and what the community wants are on the same page. And I wasn't surprised that so many of the plans mentioned walking. I think like 30 of them mentioned bicycling. None of the plans said, widen my street. And that doesn't mean that at all. I'm not suggesting that there isn't times where you want to widen the street. But the gap between what the neighborhoods wanted and what was being provided for them at the time, this was like 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago now, it was a pretty big gap. And as a result, it really fundamentally changed some of the mission of the Seattle Department of Transportation at that time, because they were listening to the community. And I won't get into all the details, but it resulted in some things going to the ballot, being approved, people really feeling like they were being listened to and they were getting the changes in their community that they wanted. So this is an example of the neighborhood part of public involvement, listening, and then bringing dollars to the table to really implement those neighborhood plans And it gets back to funding, which I mentioned earlier, is people are then willing to fund those things that they feel that they're being listened to and things that really benefit their community. It gets back again to the theme here of creating great communities through public involvement. So just a couple more details here on those plans. Every neighborhood received some funds to kind of work on the plan, though it was largely volunteer. And then they also created a kind of an oversight board. By the way, they were pretty open. They could do. It didn't have to be just transportation in their what they did, but at the same time, almost all of them zeroed in, especially pedestrian crossings and safety, sidewalks, those kinds of things, and then to a large extent also some creating better bicycling in their community. The other thing that I think is important is follow-up. It's one thing to go to, say, a public meeting, go to a charrette, go to an open house, but the public really wants to know that something happens after that and that their input is being used. So one of the things I think is always good to do is set up a website. You can read the list there, but some way of circling back to people so they know that they've been listened to. And quite often, if say you're developing a draft plan or some draft design, putting it online and then letting everybody know, say, who came to the public meetings or was involved in a survey or something, that it's there for them to comment on. And then also in the introduction to whatever you've produced, again, recap the fact that what's in that plan reflects the input that was received at prior meetings and things, so that people really see their input reflected in the final product. That builds that community trust, that builds that buy-in, if you will, and then it also gives you permission to ask for money, and do additional projects in the future because you've built that trust. And again, a lot of different ways. I think most people are familiar with these different ways of communicating with stakeholders. The one thing I would just mention here is really make it high quality. And there's just very, very good work done in all these areas. And you can see a little example here of a door hanger that you would put on for a meeting. But you don't need to reinvent all of this. It's all been done. And you can just go to the towns that are creating great communities, and you're likely to find good examples of all these different things. So this is the last image I have. So just, again, some summary comments is that involving stakeholders includes working with individual citizens, coordinating with other agency staff, working with boards and commissions, like a pedestrian advisory board, working with geographically based groups and advocacy groups and business groups, and then holding the proper events and really, again, looking at different ways to involve and inform in a way that's inclusive and brings in the entire community. So with that, James, I'll turn it back to you and any questions.
All right, thank you, Peter. Now we have some time for questions. If you haven't done so already, please enter your question in the question box on your screen, and we'll get started with questions. So far, I think I've gotten 2 questions. And the first one I've gotten is, can you give us an example of good virtual public involvement?
Yeah, I can do that.
For communities that rely on consultants that must travel hundreds of miles to make a committee meeting.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of different good models out there. Certainly doing online surveys has developed over the last number of years, and that's a good way to involve a lot of people. I've seen small towns get 500 to 1,000 people very, very quickly filling out those kinds of surveys. So I think people are used to it. And another one is, say, through interactive maps. You put a map online, and people can say you're doing a bike plan, people can easily identify what routes they ride, where there are problems, where there are barriers, where they would like to ride. So you can build these with whatever variables you would like, and so that's another really good way to do it. Another one is just through websites where you might have fact sheets, you might have a variety of different types of information available where people then can comment on things, look on things. And then the other one I would add is that say you're working on something and you have say you have an advisory group, as I mentioned earlier, that was put together just for that particular project. Certainly you're going to want to meet with that group and get to know them, and they get to know you. But just getting back to the part of the question of long distance, certainly can set it up so that you can be involved in a meeting, probably not facilitating it, but certainly doing a presentation, interactive, in a meeting, just like we're doing right now. You know, I think probably a good example of anything that we're doing right now is you can do presentations, have interaction with a smaller group. You can just make it live, or anybody can talk and go back and forth. So those are some of the ideas.
All right. For the rule of 25, what level of training or guidance do you recommend to ensure your 25 ambassadors represent your organization well?
That's a really good question. You know, I think there's probably two different kinds of training that are always useful, and they can be as short as maybe 3 hours or 4 hours each. One I think is just training in the basics of what you're doing. So let's say we have a pedestrian group, advocacy group, doing a basic training on what causes crashes, where they occur, why they occur. They're much different, for example, than how motor vehicle crashes occur. So where they occur, why they occur, just a little bit, not focusing too much on it, and then really focusing on what are the kind of countermeasures that work. What do we know about getting people safely across the street? What do we know about getting people along the street? What do we know about design that invites more use? What do we know about land use that gets more people walking? The good news is that there's a lot of research out there, much more than there used to be a few years ago. There's a lot more thinking on this. There's a lot more examples of success stories. And so we really have a lot of good information to go to and convey that information to, say, your group of 25. And you probably need to do this like once a year or something like that as new people come in, people go, and make sure that what you're interested in, what you're advocating for, in fact, are solving the problems that you want to solve. So that's kind of the design planning side. And then the other kind of training that I think is worth doing once a year is really more on your goals, objectives, kind of management side, and really figuring out as a group, what do you want to accomplish? A lot of groups, I think, just never spend the time to figure that out, and it doesn't take a lot of time. There's processes out there for kind of really focusing on that fairly quickly, by figuring out what your goal is, what your vision is, and there might be multiple goals, and then on a yearly basis, and this doesn't need to be complicated. It can be 2 to 5 pages, but put together just for your group a little mini work plan. I alluded to that earlier, and then kind of track it over the year, and then at the end of the year have a party and see what you accomplished. There's nothing like making a list, check, 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 this is what we did, as a way of motivating and getting people involved. So at a minimum, I'm thinking maybe 2 4-hour sessions where you get together, and then that really creates the venue for doing all the things that you want to do.
Great. Next question. How do you find out what kind of engagement is best for your community?
That's a good question, too. I think one of the points I was trying to make with the presentation is that you need sort of all of the above. You need the boards and commissions. You need the advocacy groups. You need the neighborhood-based groups. You need key individuals. And so in terms of figuring out where the gaps are in your community, you know, you need to look at what's happening in your community in each one of those areas, looking at what's working well. You may already have a very, very healthy bicycle advisory board that is already there, and maybe it needs a little bit of attention in terms of organization or this or that, but maybe your neighborhood groups aren't involved, or vice versa. So I think it starts with a bit of an inventory of what's happening in your community, finding out where the gaps are, and then filling it in. By the way, again, and I mentioned this before, I think the biggest gap that I see is just a few champions, which is great. We need champions, but carrying too much of the load. And then when they move out of town or they have a life change, they get a different job or something, those champions go away. And all of a sudden there's these huge gaps in the involvement advocacy community. So, you know, really building sort of institutional depth into all of these organizations is really, really important. And that's why I like the earlier question, too, about, you know, training for, say, the group of 25 or training for your pedestrian advisory board. Providing that on an annual basis, I think, is really good. Building depth in your volunteer community and making it fun. And like I said before, taking your best volunteers and sending them to a conference or something like that can be extremely beneficial in terms of building that depth.
Great. Next question. How often do you think an agency-based advisory committee, such as the BPAC, should meet? And in this case, the person asking comes from a small staff with limited capacity to manage a committee, and they want to sustain momentum.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, most committees meet once a month. I think it's reasonable, and, you know, have a set time so people know, can have an expectation of keeping that Wednesday free or whenever you do have it. One of the biggest mistakes I see with like a bike advisory board is that the staff does too much of the work, and I'll get into more of this on the next webinar, but the staff does too much of the work, and the folks on the committee don't do enough work, and everybody just gets grumpy. And so one of the keys, I think, to a good working relationship is that the board needs to set a pattern of, you know, they chair it, they set the agenda, they do the work, and it should not be more than, you know, 8 hours of work a week for a staff person who's staffing it, maybe 16, but that's the max. If you're spending more than that on it, you haven't figured out roles and responsibilities and what you're doing. So it really needs to be driven by the committee itself. When I've staffed committees, I do like to spend an hour once a month meeting with the chair to kind of go over things and making sure that you know, my job is to give them information so they can be effective in their involvement. For example, there might be a project where there's a 3-week window where your input actually matters. After that, there might be a point of no return, and your opinion doesn't matter because the project moves on. So it's really just not telling people what to do, but giving them the tools to use their time effectively. I think that's one of the main roles a staff can play. And so the other thing that you can do is you know, have subgroups that, like a technical group. Not everybody, for example, reads construction plans, but I usually find on most boards and commissions there's a couple people who are familiar with that and are comfortable doing that, and maybe they meet like before the main group meets, and then report back to the main group what they find and what their recommendations are. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways of doing it. It should be fun. It shouldn't be painful.
Okay, the next question. Could you please expound more on ways to actively engage those most affected by particular health issues or concerns? Could
you read that again? I'm not quite sure I caught that.
Would you expound more on ways to actively engage those most affected by particular health issues or concerns?
Yeah, certainly. That's a very good question, and I would say that's an evolving answer. I'm not sure that I have a 100% answer to that, but I would suggest that the basic principles are the same. Is that we need people who represent health concerns on all the different venues that I've just talked about earlier. So when you go to, for example, to a pedestrian advisory board, if there's a person on that board representing health concerns in general, and let's look at public health, that's a good place to do it. You can do it on, again, project committees that I talked about. You can do it in neighborhood groups, other boards and commissions. And so I think just in the same way that bicyclists and pedestrians have done a good job of integrating themselves into the institutional framework of the organizations in your community, I think on the public health side, that's the same thing that needs to be done so that voice becomes part of the conversation in the community.
All right. Can you suggest interesting ways to engage public involvement at the end of a long-range plan to confirm that the public's interest is covered in the plan? People seem not to be interested in reading a 100-page technical document.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, that's a good question, and there's a certain rhythm to public involvement. And let's just say we're doing a bike plan. Typically, I think in the beginning is listening, and then at the end is presenting your draft plan. And so doing a good job of listening in the beginning of any process is probably where you get the most public involvement and where it's really important to reach out to everyone. The key there, too, is to do two things. One is to keep track of all the people who are involved, and it's not uncommon to get several thousand people involved at different levels in terms of, say, one of the surveys, some of the online things I suggested, public meetings. You can get a lot of people, document that, and then secondly, really in your plan, demonstrate how this plan reflects the public involvement. So, for example, if you came up with a vision with some goals that had a lot of public involvement, you need to demonstrate how that public involvement is reflected, say, in those goals. Or say you have a map with a lot of different suggestions for improvement, say, for walking. You need to demonstrate how the priorities were identified through the public involvement so that you really have a paper trail, if you will, that shows that you did a good job of listening. And so at the end, when you do present your plan, it's very, very important to have a chapter or an appendices or throughout the plan, however you do it, really demonstrate that this plan is owned by the community you work in. Every plan should be different. Everyone should really reflect the input that you received. So hopefully that plan goes online. Hopefully people who have been involved in it are contacted and are notified that, yep, it's available, you can comment on it. And I found if you do a really good job, you don't have that many comments at the end because the plan begins to be validated by the fact that it does look like the public involvement you received. After that, of course, and I think maybe this is what the question was alluding to, public involvement is still not done. So, for example, if you do a bike master plan and there's a major, say, Rails to Trails project that's prioritized as a top priority in that plan, that doesn't mean that you don't do ongoing public involvement. When you start moving forward with that project, hopefully you don't have to have the conversation again about, are we even going to do this project? But you do need to have a lot of conversation about access and design and safety and all sorts of issues related to that project. So the public involvement continues after the plan is adopted.
All right, thank you. The next question. Bicycling advocates are relatively easy to identify and engage. Pedestrian advocates, not so much, particularly in rural and suburban areas. Do you have any suggestions for how to best identify and engage pedestrian advocates?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's something that's a challenge everywhere. A couple things. One is the models that have worked really well for bicyclists are not going to necessarily be the same models that work for pedestrians. There'll be some overlap, but there'll be some difference. And some of it is going to come down to just how you identify yourself and kind of the words you use. People identify as bicycle advocates. People don't identify as pedestrian advocates, first of all. So usually the pattern that I've seen is, bicycle advocates will get together and form an advocacy group, whereas people who are concerned about walking issues will get more involved either through their school, there's a lot of walking issues around schools, or their neighborhood group. And they won't call themselves pedestrian advocates, but they'll see themselves as neighborhood advocates and advocates for safe walking for their children, for their parents, their grandparents. And so that's why I used the example a while ago of the 38 neighborhood groups, is really looking at that and realizing that of those 36 neighborhood groups that put walking issues in as a priority, I don't think any of them saw themselves as pedestrian advocates. They saw themselves as advocates for creating a great community where they could walk and bike. And so I always suggest to people who are just getting going in this area is to really focus on neighborhood planning. I think probably schools usually are the best place to start, just because there's almost always immediate consensus. Yes, we are concerned about the safety of our children, and so it's one of the least divisive kinds of things, and it really gives you a way to have that discussion. But don't try to turn them into pedestrian advocates. You don't have to use those words, but you do want to turn everybody into being passionate about their neighborhood, about their school.
All right, thanks, Peter. Next question. With regards to social media, is there a common rule of thumb about posting that should be followed? And beyond Facebook, Twitter, and Flickr, is there another tool that you think is effective? Yeah, I think some rules of thumb are that you really want to both provide information. Again, there's two halves to this: provide information, and then be really clear about where you can provide input, and also then to be creative of how people can provide that input. And it can be, again, I mentioned before, it can be just a comment. It can be something related to a survey. It can be something related to, say, an interactive map. And then always the rule of thumb is post the results. Because if you don't post the results, it's like people don't know they've been listened to. And show how the results are being incorporated into what you're doing. It's like pushing a push button with no light on it. You push it and you don't know if anything's happened. And we've all seen people walk up to a push button and you bang it about 6 times. And you're still not confident it heard you. And so people need to be assured that they've been listened to. And I think that's probably the most important messaging. The other one, beyond the ones that were just mentioned, the ones that I find are the other technique, and I alluded to this earlier, is what I'm going to call resender's list. So, for example, if you have, say, a Greenway advocacy group, and there's 1,000 people on that mailing list, you don't say, give us your mailing list. But what you do is you say, can we develop a message, some content that you could then send to all your members, or maybe a button that can be clicked on your website that will, give you this information. So I'm finding more and more is that it's really a good way to get the word out. It gets back to the theory that it's not
sometimes what you say, but who says it. So if you're a Greenway advocacy group and say you're interested in a trail project, which also can be a linear greenway, you put it on the local bike advocacy's website, or a message goes out. The fact that you trust the leadership, say, of that bike group, you say, oh, this must be good. So it's a lot about, again, who says it and trusting the organization that's saying it. I know for myself, and I think it's true for most people, some organizations we belong to and we pay a membership fee and we're very involved in it. A lot of organizations, we just trust them. We send in our check once a year, read their newsletter or whatever that comes out, and we just say, fine, good, I'll just be involved and support it because I trust this organization. So really understanding that that's how a lot of people are going to be involved, is just trusting the organization, and that's why getting various organizations to redo their resenders list and be involved that way, I think is very, very effective.
All right, and Peter, I'd like to add to this question. With regard to social media, I think it's important to make sure you remain consistent in how frequent you post something. So if you can try to post daily, that helps to build a following. Also, the more frequently you post on things like Facebook, the more likely people are to see it, because Facebook has programs that limit or will post things on some people's sites and not others. So the more frequently you post and the larger your following, the more likely the people who follow you will actually get to see your post. So those are important things to consider as well. Yeah,
and just to nuance that a little more, I'm glad you brought that up. If it's just posting something, doing it often, I think is good. On the other hand, if you're going to, say, issue action alert, or come to this meeting or write this letter, if you abuse that and use it too often, people will start ignoring it, because everything's a big issue. Everything's a fire drill. And so depending on what kind of messaging you're doing, it needs to be a bit more nuanced in terms of frequency and how often do you sound the fire alarm.
All right, thank you, Peter. Next question. Does community size affect the best method of engaging the public? In a township with a couple of thousand residents, what's the more effective method to getting enough public feedback?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and you really do need to know your community. Different communities are going to have completely, especially smaller ones, are going to have different cultures and really different ways of involving people. Some communities have individuals who really do represent those communities, and like if it's a community built around one or two big businesses, for example, that may be a community where you really need to get some of those key individuals involved in a different way. Other communities are going to have a lot of, say, citizens with language issues, and that's going to require a whole different approach in terms of being sensitive to that. So yeah, I think knowing your community, I would still argue you want a comprehensive approach, but I would also argue that knowing your community is going to affect how you do outreach. Just one that comes to mind, another example is focus groups. Depending on who is in your community, you're going to adjust the kind of focus groups that you have in terms of involving people. So if you're a retirement community, you're going to have a lot of focus groups with folks who are retired, for example. Or if you're a community with tons of young kids and they're all walking to school, that's going to require a different kind of focus, say, around schools. So it's a good question.
Can you offer any suggestions on how to reach out to and engage with marginalized populations?
Yeah, that's again a good question. There's a lot of different ways that it's done. Let me just give you an example of a school that I work with, and I'm familiar with the people who work there. This was a school, inner city school, with mostly Spanish-speaking parents and kids, And what they did there is, just to give you one example, is had community gardens close to the school. As part of that outreach effort, the kids, this was a K through 5 school, worked in the gardens, and it was through a science class, but used the community gardens by the school and on the school grounds to learn all the science. And then had a big community party to celebrate and eat the food they grew, and grew foods that everyone knew were popular in that community. All the parents came and got involved in that, and that was a way for the parents to meet the teachers, to become more involved in the school. And so you got both the science part, you got the community gardens part, you got the public health part, and you got almost all the parents involved in that particular school. So that's just one example of doing it. But I think it's again, it takes a lot of work, and it's really meeting people, where they're at.
Great, thank you. When your community stops attending your open house in a rural community, what else can you do to get input when you have few funds?
When they stop attending?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it sounds like a plural question to me, so maybe you're having too many meetings. I don't know. But again, I think the key is that you don't have too many meetings. Give people lots of different ways to be involved, and institutionalize it. If you're not getting people involved, I think you need to step back and say, why aren't people involved? And it could be that there's a sense that my opinion doesn't matter. And then you go back to some of the principles I talked about earlier, is how do you validate people's involvement so that they really see that their involvement makes a difference. It's easy for, I find in a lot of communities where you don't get good turnout is a certain cynicism because, in fact, the feedback hasn't been there to show that their involvement is meaningful. The other is to, again, institutionalize the involvement. That's why I talked about like an advisory group or something like that, where you institutionalize it, but you also make a really big deal of it. And that's why I was mentioning, get a mayoral proclamation or whatever the case may be. You need to get some recognition for your involvement. So when you don't get involvement, I would go back to all the things I went through earlier and say, are we missing any of these pieces? And it doesn't have to be a big meeting. If money is an issue, as you've mentioned too, I think that's where the social media and the electronic involvement can be good because, again, you can reach a lot of people with not a lot of cost in terms of electronic involvement.
All right, thank you. You'd mentioned the Seattle Neighborhood Study. What is the best way to access that study?
Yeah, it wasn't a study. It was 38 different neighborhood plans, and these were done a number of years ago, and some of them have been updated. At one point, they were all online. I haven't looked recently, but I'm pretty confident that they could be just looked at online in terms of Seattle neighborhood plans.
All right. What are some ways that you've seen older adults use as an asset for public outreach, such as by volunteering to engage the community?
Well, I don't know that it's age specific. I think it gets back to what I mentioned earlier, is that whatever you do, it needs to look like your community. It needs to be diverse, and having part of that diversity is having people of all ages involved in everything you do. So I think it's a matter of being purposeful about getting that age spectrum involved. And I don't. You certainly can do an age-specific advocacy group, and I've seen that, and that can be very, very effective too, to really focusing on some of those issues. So that would be a second way to do it.
All right. Would you recommend calling individuals to remind them about an upcoming engagement activity you have, or is that getting too involved?
The answer, of course, it depends. I think, it's partly quantity and quality issues sometimes, and there's certain meetings that you really want certain people to be there. There's nothing wrong with calling them, especially if it's a smaller meeting and there's, say, half a dozen key people that you want at a meeting. Calling them can be good. I think the key to getting attendance, though, and I used to organize a lot of block clubs, neighborhood groups many, many years ago, and I worked on a lot of block clubs in some fairly distressed neighborhoods, and I found the key to getting people there is to give everybody a job. So say you're organizing a block club and so you're getting together to clean up a vacant lot. First of all, it's at somebody's house, and then have somebody bring a drink, some Kool-Aid or whatever, pop, whatever you're going to bring. Somebody else bring the coffee. Somebody else bring cookies. Somebody else bring pens and paper. And so if you have a job to do, then you're more likely to come. The other thing that I think is really important is that everybody have a job, have an assignment when you have meetings, so they really have a reason to come back, especially some of the smaller ones I'm thinking here. I'm thinking small just because that's typically where you're going to do the one-on-one invitations, is that people get recognized for the work they do, and they have an assignment. So, for example, getting back to the group of 25, one of the things that I always recommend people do is when they have a meeting is the first thing you do is have a round robin, and everybody gets to report, this month I wrote this letter, or this month I called this elected official, or we got this great outcome, or here's a thank you letter I wrote, so that everybody gets a minute or so to talk about what they've done and to get some recognition for the good things they've done. And that's that kind of, you feel cared for and listened to, and you're going to come back to the next meeting because, again, it's fun, it's positive, and you get that positive reinforcement.
All right, I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. Public meetings can oftentimes become quite contentious. How did you alleviate the worst or most contentious situation you've encountered in a public meeting?
Sure.
And what tactics would you suggest people engage to calm folks during a highly contentious meeting?
Yeah, certainly. I think I alluded to a few of these things already. One is, not to do just the standard public hearing. The other is, I think, really good facilitation. So, for example, if you're having an open house, and say you have 3 or 4 stations, and you give people opportunity to provide input in all the different ways I outlined earlier, and then say you have a presentation in the middle of that, and it's a contentious sort of issue. I think on the that part of it, so say you have a little presentation, and then you have some Q&A. That's where really having a skilled and trained moderator is really important. Just again, more training than we have time for here, but a couple of the rules of thumb is, tell people, okay, this is for questions only. It's not, if you have testimony you want to give, public testimony, that's why we have the public comment forms. That's why we have the maps you can write on, or whatever the case may be. But make it real clear it's questions only, and then if people get off target, then the moderator needs to keep moving it on. Also make it clear that you're going to move around the room. You're not going to just stay in one spot. Also make it clear that you're going to keep the mic. If you give away your mic, you'll lose control of the meeting. Things like that. So that's a whole separate area of having good facilitators and having the training and know how to do it. Been in many, many meetings where 500 people are there. It's split. There's a bit of tension. And again, that's the big meeting. The key really is to really give people a lot of different options for input, and then have a really trained facilitator who can manage the meeting. That's real quick, but there's a lot more to that. That could be a whole session in itself.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, I think that's about all the time we have today for discussion. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question today. A PDF copy of the presentation slides will be available later this week at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars, and a recording of today's program will be posted to that site as well as to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/pedbikeinfo, within a couple of weeks. Be sure to follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/pedbike for updates on those postings. Also, please remember to join us on July 17th for our next webinar in this two-part series, Creating Great Communities Through Public Involvement, How to Create and Run an Effective Advisory and Advocacy Groups. Finally, I want to remind you that a very brief survey will appear once the webinar is ended. We very much appreciate you taking a moment to complete it. I want to thank again our speaker, Peter Lagerwey, and thank you to all of you for attending today's PBIC Livable Communities webinar.